All rights reserved with Yolanda Taylor on Choice.
Good morning, everybody. Grab your coffee, settle in, and welcome to another episode of All Rights Reserved. I'm Yolanda Taylor, known as the community lawyer. Every week on this show, we try to do more than just react to the headlines, right? We try to really understand what they mean and how they affect our communities. Every week on the show, whether I have a guest or whether I'm solo, we try to do more than, like I say, react. So today's conversation, it may be a little different because I'm not really here to tell you what to think. I am actually here to figure out, do you care? I'm here to ask one important question, and that question is, should Black people care? Welcome again to All Rights Reserved. So let's get started. Should we care about Supreme Court decisions? Should we care about changes in presidential power? Should we care about who oversees our elections? Should we care when legislators that we elected, even if we didn't, they represent our district? Should we care when they don't even bother to show up and vote? Should we care when another young Black person dies under circumstances that leaves families searching for answers? Should we care when these circumstances leave families searching for answers? Or have we become so mentally exhausted by politics and public life that we've decided that none of it really matters, right? Because we're trying to protect maybe our own mental health. Maybe you've heard people say, politics doesn't affect me. Both parties are the same. My vote doesn't count. Nothing ever changes. We've all have heard someone along the way say at least one of those things, right? But is it really true? And this is what we should ask ourselves. Is it really true? Because whether we realize it or not, government touches where we live. I've said that time and time again. It touches what our children learn, how elections are being ran, right? We're seeing that now, and how justice is being administered in our court system and around who even gets arrested to begin with, right? And even when we get to make decisions, y'all, that affect our everyday lives, we still may feel as if we're being marginalized in the process. So today, I just want us to simply take a deep breath. Like I say, grab your coffee, grab whatever you need this morning, because I want us to think together, right? Let's not think as Democrats. Let's not think as Republicans. Let's not think as independents, but let's just think as citizens, right? As neighbors, as a community, as Black people. Because again, my question is, should Black people care? You tell me, should we care? Should we care? And that is a deep question that I'm asking because I think it's very important that that question is asked. So let's begin where so much power begins, and that is the United States Supreme Court, y'all. The United States Supreme Court. That is where there's a lot of power, that our Constitution actually created it that way, right? But let's think about this together. This segment is how the Supreme Court of the United States is reshaping America, because that's what it's doing, y'all. It is reshaping America. So before we even get into specific headlines, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about this. Let's talk about the philosophy of the United States Supreme Court. We're seeing how that has changed over the course of a lifetime. You know, those of you who may be my age, Gen Xers, and especially baby boomers, and maybe even millennials, we are seeing how the Supreme Court is changing, right? The philosophy of the United States Supreme Court, us lawyers, we refer to it as its jurisprudence, right? That's simply a fancy word for how judges think about the Constitution. Because here's something that I've learned over the years. The Supreme Court rarely changes America overnight. It changes America one case at a time. Sometimes those changes happen so gradually we don't notice it until years later, right? And whether you agree with this court or not, there's no question that the court we're watching today is reshaping the relationship between the American people. And what I'm talking about, they're reshaping the relationship between Congress. They're reshaping the relationship between the president and the federal government itself, right? So what we can talk about with some specificity is the fact that it's happening during an administration where Trump is the president. So let's talk about the Trump effect on the court. One reason this matters is because President Donald Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices during his first term. I call it Trump 1.0. He appointed Justice Neil Gorsuch. He appointed Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, right? Those appointments created the court's current 6-3 conservative majority, which has significantly influenced constitutional law over the past several terms. Now, that doesn't mean the court rules in favor of President Trump every time. In fact, even more recently, we see that it doesn't. Sometimes the court has ruled against him. Sometimes, and it has felt like a lot of times, it has ruled for him. But there is a noticeable judicial philosophy emerging. And what is that philosophy, you may ask? Well, several themes have appeared repeatedly, I will say. First, there's been greater presidential authority given. This Supreme Court has increasingly recognized broader authority for presidents to supervise and remove executive branch officials, though it has placed limits on that authority in cases involving institutions like the Federal Reserve. Second, there's been less deference to the federal bureaucracy. For decades, federal agencies had broad authority to interpret laws passed by Congress. But this court has been skeptical of giving unelected agencies expansive power. Instead, it has increasingly said that the majority policy decisions belong to Congress unless Congress clearly delegates that authority. Third, a stronger emphasis on the text of the Constitution, like when you're actually reading the Constitution and you're trying to interpret the actual text of the Constitution and statutes. Many members of this court describe themselves as textualists or originalists, and that's what the conservative justices have described themselves as. Clarence Thomas is one, and I know most of us in our community are most familiar with Justice Clarence Thomas. Well, he considers himself to be a originalist. And so you may ask, what does that mean? What did these words mean, I guess, when they were adopted, instead of what outcome seems fairest today? That's what originalists mean. When they were looking at the Constitution, they were looking at the statute. They want to know what was the meaning of these words when they were first adopted, even if they have to go all the way back, I don't know, to the beginning of the Constitution when it was written. They want to know what it meant at that time when the founders wrote it, right? Instead of, right, what outcomes seems fairest today. Whether you agree or disagree, this mindset that they call themselves originalists is an important shift that has happened on the Supreme Court. So who are the winners and who are the losers, or what are the wins and what are the losses, I should say? And I think this is important. Sometimes people have described the Supreme Court as simply Trump's court. And I felt that way as well. But I really, as a lawyer, I think that's too simplistic. This term alone is simplistic. I mean, the court strengthened presidential removal authority in important cases recently, right, involving independent agencies. But it also rejected recently or limited parts of President Trump's agenda in other cases, including challenges involving tariffs, the recent case regarding the birthright citizenship procedures, and the Federal Reserve. So the better way to think about it is this. This court is not always ruling for Donald Trump. I guess they have somewhat of a backbone, especially Justice Roberts. It is often ruling, I feel, based on how it seems the Constitution should read. It's ruling based on what I've described as its constitutional philosophy. So that in many cases, though, it happens to be aligned with positions that President Trump has advocated. So that is an important distinction. Again, he appointed 3 of the justices, right? Because he knew they were conservative and that their philosophy may align more conservative or more right. But the question again is, should Black people care? Why should the Black community care? And this is why I think it matters, y'all. Every Supreme Court decision becomes somebody's real life. Sometimes it's voting. We're seeing what's happening in the South, in Tennessee, and Florida, right here in North Carolina, this redistricting map, how they're trying to dilute Black voting power. Sometimes it's education. We're seeing how in some places it seems as if our history is being erased. It's not like we had that much history being taught in the first place in our school system, but we're seeing it as it relates to the attack on museums and the history and the narratives around, you know, what happened to our ancestors who were Africans who came over here and were enslaved, who came over here forcefully, you know, not voluntarily, but were enslaved. We're seeing that trying to be whitewashed or erased. Sometimes it's affirmative action. We've seen how the whole affirmative action scenario has played out before the Supreme Court, and that is struck down affirmative action. Sometimes it's policing, right? Those cases that a lot of us care about, and those cases seem to get a lot of attention because it deals with criminal justice, and we see it in real time on TV or on social media, interactions in our community that involve the cops. Sometimes it's housing, right? There's an affordability crisis here in America. So sometimes it's housing, sometimes it's healthcare, sometimes it's religious liberty, sometimes it's immigration and ICE, sometimes it's who has power to make decisions. That's why the Supreme Court decisions just don't belong to lawyers. These decisions belong to all of us. So I do want to hear from you. You know, even if you don't call in today, you can always call the show back and ask for me. You can later follow me on our YouTube channel, and you can make comments there as well. But I do want to hear, do you think presidents should have more power or less? Should independent agencies remain independent? Should unelected federal agencies be able to make major policy decisions? Or should those decisions belong to elected officials? How much power is too much? So we're talking about all of this. And if you're going to understand why these questions matter today, we have to understand how we got here, guys. So let's take a quick trip through history, because history always has something to teach us. Okay, before we move into the headlines, again, we're going to have a history minute here, y'all. Woo, history minute. There was a time in America when Black citizens, as we know, could not vote. Not because our ancestors didn't want to, but because they were deliberately prevented from doing so. After Reconstruction, many Southern states imposed literacy tests, poll taxes, intimidation tactics, and outright violence to suppress Black voting. Then came what's known as Bloody Sunday in 1965. There were peaceful marches across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, but those peaceful marchers were beaten by state troopers while demanding voting rights. The images shocked the nation. Just months later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most significant civil rights laws in American history. For many Black families, voting wasn't simply about politics, it was about dignity, citizenship, representation, and being counted. So when conversations arise today, right, about election administration or voting rules, like having to have an ID or the SAVE Act that Trump is threatened not to, I guess, sign this landmark housing bill over because he wants stricter restrictions around voting, like even the requirement to possibly bring your birth certificate in order to prove that you're a citizen before you can vote in a federal election. That's something called the SAVE Act, SAVE. So when we hear all these conversations around elections, many Black Americans, many of our neighbors, we don't see those issues in isolation, right? We see those issues as they're trying to take us back, guys. That's how we see it, because most of us know history. We understand the history I just went over. And so when we hear these conversations, we have a right to sit up and be like, what are they talking about? We remember the struggle it took to just get a seat at the table. Whether you're conservative or liberal, whether you support today's policies or oppose them, history reminds us that participation has always mattered. The question isn't simply who wins, right? This is more than partisan politics. It's whether the process remains one that the public can trust. So should Black people care about protecting the vote our ancestors fought to secure? So while you're thinking about that question, I'm going to keep it moving. So who really runs the government? Again, we just talked about the Supreme Court and the enormous power that it has. But when people think about Washington, D.C., they still usually think about the president, right? But here's something that many Americans don't realize. Again, the president's only one person running the government. There are 100 of these federal agencies I've been talking about, right? And I've just mentioned that the Supreme Court has recently ruled that the president has a right to remove some of these people who are on these federal agencies. Some of you may have heard of, some of you may haven't heard of what's called the Federal Trade Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Reserve. You heard a lot about the Federal Reserve lately. And what about the Election Assistance Commission? Many of these federal agencies many of them were intentionally designed by Congress to operate independently from politics. Why? Because Congress, once upon a time, believed some decisions should be based on expertise rather than whichever political party happened to win the last election, right? That seems logical, right? You want expertise when it comes to making hard decisions, and you don't want politics to be involved. For decades, presidents could not simply remove many of these officials whenever they wanted. That has begun to change because, again, the philosophy of the Supreme Court is reshaping America, guys, one case at a time. The Supreme Court has increasingly, again, recognized broader presidential authority to remove certain leaders of independent agencies. Supporters say that's exactly what democracy requires. Their argument is simple. They say the American people elected the president, so therefore the president should control the executive branch. However, opponents say something different. They argue that independent agencies exist precisely because some governmental decisions shouldn't swing or change every 4 years depending on who wins an election, right? Neither side is asking a small question. They're asking one of the biggest constitutional questions in America. How much power should the president have? Regardless if you're a Republican or Democrat, this is going to impact you. How much power should the president of the United States have? Then there came this other story, sister girl Lisa Cook, who very powerful woman that sits on the Federal Reserve Board. She serves on that board, right? So you may have heard her name. Unlike some other independent agencies, the Supreme Court recently allowed litigation over her removal to continue rather than permit her immediate removal. Why? And this is when Trump was trying to come after her, y'all. Look it up, Lisa Cook. Why? Because the Federal Reserve has traditionally occupied a unique constitutional and economic role. Its independence affects interest rates, inflation, retirement accounts, mortgages, and financial markets across the world. Again, I'm not asking whether you agree. I'm asking whether it's worth paying attention to. Should Black people care? Should anybody care? Because Supreme Court decisions, as I've expressed, they don't just stay inside of courtrooms. Eventually, they reach our homes. So they allow the litigation to happen, but most recently in a Supreme Court case, or a case that went before the Supreme Court, it was called Trump versus Cook. I'm talking about Lisa Cook. The Supreme Court did rule that the president cannot fire Federal Reserve governors at will. So they did create what's called a narrow exception just to maintain the central bank's independence. They realized, thank God, that the central bank needed independence and that these policies can't just keep changing because the politics are changing and who's in power changes, right? But should, and this is a question for you, if you're listening, should every president be able to replace everyone in the government? Even though I know there's an exception carved out for the central bank or the Federal Reserve, but should they be able to replace everyone in government because they're the president and that's their executive branch? But should there be some agencies that remain some form of independence because it's expertise there and they're supposed to be above politics? Does independence create accountability? Some people may say it may not. Or does presidential control create accountability? Do you see what I did there? Does independence create accountability as it relates to these independent agencies? Or does presidential control create accountability? Let's talk about it, y'all. Follow me on YouTube. I Love Choice FM, All Rights Reserved show. So again, should Black people care who sits on the Supreme Court? Should Black people care about how much control the President of the United States has? So if we're talking about this power that we've been talking about, we also need to dive a little deeper into elections because every election depends on public confidence. Do you have confidence in our current election system? So let's talk about the people who are responsible for helping administer our elections. So this segment is called Who Protects Our Elections? And it's important that we talk about this because while that other case, Trump versus Cook, was happening, and the Supreme Court carved out an exception for the Central Reserve Bank, saying that the president couldn't remove Lisa Cook or he couldn't fire anybody on the Federal Reserve, bank, they did allow him the authority, the broad authority, to fire members of independent federal agencies at will. And this was decided by the 6-3 conservative majority court. They established that he has that power. The court struck down federal laws that had previously limited the president's ability to remove independent commissioners like those on the Federal Trade Commission, to only cases involving where there's a finding of inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance, right? So prior law, get this, limited a president's ability to fire these people, right? Unless there was some showing of malfeasance, neglect of duty, or inefficiency, right? But so they overturned years of precedent, right? And that's a legal term. When I mean precedent, they overturned cases that have been on the books for years to give this president broader authority to fire people, y'all. This was a 91-year-old case. In legal terms, we call it precedent. There was a 90-year-old precedent in this case called Humphrey's Executor versus the United States, which previously prevented presidents from dismissing independent commissioners without cause. See, like, it wasn't like you could never do it back in the day. You just had to show that there was a reason for it, right? But now President Trump can just send "you're fired" letters with no reason at all. And he has done that as of today. Have you heard of the Election Assistance Commission, right? Now, the Federal Election Assistance Commission, they don't count votes, right? They don't decide the elections. The people on there don't. States do that, right? States decide elections. So the Federal Election Assistance Commission doesn't count votes again. It does not decide elections. States do that. Instead, this commission, the Election Assistance Commission, it certifies voting systems. It provides grant money, it helps local election officials, and it maintains what are the best practices, right, around election systems. It supports election administration nationwide. Well, this morning when I woke up and looked at my phone, I saw that President Trump had fired all of the sitting commissioners, right, on the Election Assistance Commission, leaving no members on it, right? So it's basically a defunct commission now. There's nobody sitting on it. He fired the Democrats, and I heard he did allow one Republican to resign, and another Republican had voluntarily left to go somewhere else before then. So now, y'all, we need to ring the alarms about this, right? See how I led into this about power and what the president could do, what the Supreme Court has done to broaden Trump's power, and he has taken his cue from the Supreme Court. He went ahead and fired those folks who determine what the best practices should be around our voting systems, right? The ones who give the different states money, right, to help improve the voting systems, right? The people who don't even count the votes and they don't even decide elections. They're independent and they act bipartisan. They act like nonpartisan, right? They're not partisan at all. I don't know what their personal beliefs are, but I'm just saying as a commission, it was not a partisan commission. So I'm not asking you, again, to pick sides. I'm just asking you to think about this, right? Think about this. Supporters argue that Trump was simply exercising presidential authority, the one that the Supreme Court gave him, right? Critics, though, are worried about what this means just months before the 2026 elections. Again, the midterm elections. That's what I'm talking about in November. Again, I'm not asking you to pick a side. I am still asking another question. Should election administration ever appear political? Will your answer change depending on which party controls the White House? Should the public care more about the integrity of elections than who wins them? So people are concerned about what's going to happen, right? Will you feel differently if another president did the exact same thing, like a Democrat president? Will you feel differently? Should election agencies remain bipartisan? And what builds public trust? What builds public trust? Is it the independence of these commissions that are supposed to act in a nonpartisan way? Or is it this broader control that a partisan president can have, whether they're a Democrat or Republican? And again, that final question again is, should Black people care? Should we care about who oversees the machinery of our elections? Should we care? So let's leave Washington, D.C. and federal politics, and let's come right here to North Carolina, good old North Kakalaki, right? Let's talk about this segment, and this segment is called Showing Up is Part of the Job. How many of you have a job? Raise your hand if you're watching me. If you're listening to me, you can raise your hand in your living room, in your car. Who has a job, right? In order to keep that job, don't we have to show up, right? Well, this is taken straight from the headlines. So now we're getting into headlines. And this is from an NPR news source, right? And it's all over. WRL, all the news sources have reported on what has recently happened in North Carolina. And that is that Republicans in the North Carolina House successfully overrode 4 of Governor Josh Stein's vetoes recently at the end of June, after these bills have been sitting on the House calendar for nearly a year. There were three bills, because Josh Stein, again, is the governor of North Carolina. He actually vetoed these bills that the Republicans were trying to pass. But these bills that they drafted, the Republicans did, prohibited diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, policies in state government and public education. That was three of the bills that did that. The fourth bill required state law enforcement agencies, or it will require state law enforcement agencies to cooperate with immigration and custom enforcement. In other words, ICE. So you got that. Three of the bills prohibited DEI policies in state government and public education. The fourth bill requires state law enforcement officers, police, sheriff, state troopers, to cooperate with ICE. The Republicans were finally able to override the governor's veto because two House members who represented possible swing votes didn't show up and do their job. They were absent, right? So let's dive a little deep. Before I tell you who they were, you may already know if you're involved in reading the news and in politics. Let's talk about the bills that they successfully overrode the governor's veto around. So that just means that the governor veto, which is a way that the governor can say, oh, nope, this is not going to become law. Now they were able to get enough votes because two people didn't show up to do their jobs. They were able to say, oh, nope, yes, it can become law. That was Senate Bill 227, which prohibits K through 12 schools from teaching or promoting a list of what they have labeled to be 12 divisive concepts, right? That they think are inherently racist, sexist, or unlawful, framing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as policies that demand people to judge others based on race, sex, or other protected classes. This is all the conservative legislators' language, right? They believe, anything that talks about diversity, equity, and inclusion is promoting reverse racism against whites, or reverse sexism, or against people who may not be gay or a part of the LGBTQAI community. And they also feel like, diversity, equity, inclusion policies demand people to judge others based on race, sex, or other protected classes. When those of us who are involved in this work, like I am, I'm like, that's totally the opposite of what it does. It's totally the opposite of what it's done. But do you see what they're doing? Like, history has shown us, voting rights, housing rights, employment rights. It was Black, brown, indigenous people who have been discriminated against historically, right? But now there's this new framing that says, this new narrative that the Republicans and the conservatives are creating that say, no, it's us white people. White people, those of us who have the most power in the society, white people, we're the ones being discriminated against, right? Because it's like the fight for inclusion, the fight for fairness, the fight for having diverse hiring practices, they're now saying that it discriminates against them. So that's the narrative, right? So this whole bill is drafted in a way to say that anything that once before now promoted fairness, equity, inclusion in the workplace, in school, like the incorporation of, Black history, which, I'm 53, so I know, like, I've grown up in schools. I've never seen anything about our history, right? You would think we did nothing, right? If you read history books. My kids are like 12 and 15, and when I ask them about what they're learning in social studies or history, I mean, you really don't see the contributions of Black people, documented in educational curriculum, right? You have to go up to a college or HBCU to really get that history, right? Or your parents have to teach it to you. But they're saying that to teach that history is inherently racist, right? And I guess for the LGBTQAI community, to insert anything about them is inherently sexist, I guess, to straight people, or people that they consider to be non-members of the LGBTQAI community. And then the policies of DEI are, according to them, unlawful. So the groups that promote DEI policies in public education, like the National Society of High School Scholars, instead like me, describe these as programs that allow for a healthy debate around race, gender identity, income inequality, and other forms of discrimination. And they feel like the measures that our current General Assembly legislators have taken, are harmful, right? But it looks like maybe these measures make exceptions for speech that's protected by the First Amendment and instruction on historical oppression, provided that it's taught in an impartial manner. So they're saying that you can talk a little bit about historical oppression, but you can't get passionate like I just did when I was talking about it. You have to have a monotone, impartial voice when you're teaching on historical oppression. And I get that, I'm fair. Yeah, I don't think a teacher should be acting like an advocate. They should just be teaching. So, I mean, believe it or not, I get that little piece of it. So thank God that, there would be some instruction on historical oppression. I just don't know how deep it can go. But Senate Bill 558, the other bill, did the same thing for public universities, right? And that could include some HBCUs, right? Some HBCUs are public universities. So, for students, parents, and staff at these public universities, that could mean closures of any remaining DEI offices, changes in employee diversity training. Instructors at public universities can still discuss the list of divisive concepts that they consider to be divisive concepts, but they cannot endorse them or require students to endorse them. And I don't think they were requiring students to endorse them to begin with, but I guess the conservative legislators just want to make sure that that's not happening. But the state Senate had already overridden both of Governor Stein's vetoes on these bills. But now that the House has done it, these bills are now law. They're now law, y'all. Now, the other one the third one was House Bill 171, and that again was a bill that targeted DEI, but it targeted DEI programs in state and local government. So they got the K through 12 schools, they got the public universities, and now they are prohibiting DEI programs in state and local governments. It bars public funds for being used for DEI initiatives, offices, staff positions, or training. It claims it's not meant to violate federal civil rights laws or restrict reasonable accommodations for protected classes. But that bill is one that still needs to be overridden by the state Senate to become law. So they haven't got to that one yet, but a lot of people believe that they will get to that one. Based on the last time I checked, the news change constantly. Now the immigration bill and ICE, we know how ICE has disrupted some of our communities, but Senate Bill 153 requires that state law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Adult Correction, the State Highway Patrol, and the State Bureau of Investigation, to enter into formal agreements with ICE. This bill also waives immunity for local governments that violate the prohibition against sanctuary policies, meaning cities and counties can face civil lawsuits if someone who should be subject to an ICE detainer is released and then commits a crime. So, there's been some debate locally, like in Wilson, about whether or not one of the city council persons was trying to advance a sanctuary city policy. Well, this bill is basically going to put a chilling effect on cities and counties who are thinking about sanctuary policies, because they can be sued if ICE is trying to detain someone and that person is then released and then commits a crime. But that bill, Senate Bill 153, is now law. So why did this happen? This goes back to the whole topic again about because people don't show up to do their jobs. Senators, or state representatives, I should say, state representatives Carla Cunningham. She was a former Democrat until she lost the midterms, and now she's unaffiliated. She's from Mecklenburg County. And State Representative Shelley Willingham, a Democrat from Edgecombe County, y'all, they were absent for the House's vote in session, right, when this happened. Even though they had been present earlier in the day for some kind of committee meeting, they, for whatever reason, were absent when it came time to vote. And their absence allowed for the Republicans to override Governor Stein's vetoes of these DEI bills that he and others felt were harmful or unnecessary. So what do you think? Should we care? Should we care about any of that? One thing my parents taught me, if you commit to something like a job, you show up, right? But I guess these two didn't. And again, the Republicans successfully overrode several vetoes issued by Governor Josh Stein because these two House members were absent. One Democrat, one that was a former Democrat but became an unaffiliated member, they weren't present. And that gave the Republicans enough votes to meet the constitutional threshold for overriding the governor's vetoes. So if voters elect you, do you have a responsibility to show up even after you lost your primary election? Or are they salty because they lost their primary election? I don't know. Can not voting change history just as much as voting? We saw here that it did. If your absence changes the outcome, is that accountability or simply part of politics? I'm asking you. And should we care? Should Black people care that those state representatives from our communities that we primarily elect, they didn't show up and vote, and harmful diversity, equity, and inclusion bills were overridden and became law? These bills, the veto of these bills were overridden and these harmful bills became law. So should attendance matter? You be the judge. Now, our last segment, guys, before I land this plane, is on everything that we've been seeing in the headlines. And this doesn't have to do with the state government or the federal government. This has to do with our culture, things that we see online that may rage bait us, as the young people say. And there are a lot of things I see online I don't even comment on because I feel like it's rage baiting me, or it's affecting me mentally, or it's just too much trauma to believe, right? I don't even want to believe it because it would be trauma to me. So I'm talking about Nolan Wells, right? This case here, this young guy, young Mississippi teenager who lost his life. His family is now being represented by Benjamin Crump. But this segment is called Nolan Wells, Trust, Truth, and the Search for Answers. This story has captured the nation's attention. Again, I believe he was 18 years old. He was a student athlete. His body, unfortunately, was found after disappearing during a 4th of July out in near Horn Island, Mississippi, guys. And I was just in Mississippi for a family reunion when all these stories started popping up on my social media pages. So, but his family is asking for transparency. Again, they retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump. They're asking for answers, like any family in this situation will want to know, that will want to ask for answers. They're asking for honesty. They're asking anyone with photos or videos to come forward. But like I said, social media has done what social media often does. Speculation has spread quickly. Some people have pointed to the fact that several of Nolan's friends were white. Others have pushed back, saying we shouldn't rush to judgment, and why are you bringing race into this, right? We're seeing a lot of this, y'all. And I'm going to blame it on the Gen X and the Gen X and some millennials too. But it's all of us. But the young people, y'all are really, y'all don't play. Y'all not playing any games on social media, right? So we're seeing a lot of pushback. And here's where I land, right? I feel like most people, families deserve answers. Communities deserve transparency, but people also deserve fairness. We should never convict anyone in a court of public opinion simply because of rumor of race. Regardless of how we personally feel, as a lawyer, I have to say we shouldn't convict people in a court of public opinion, because that pendulum can swing our way, right? And then we can get hateful calls, harassment. Some of these parents of some of Nolan's friends who happen to be white, they're concerned that they're going to be targets of a hate crime or harassment, right? So that's why I say we should never convict anyone in the court of public opinion simply because of rumor or race. At the same time, I think it's important to understand why many Black families are asking these questions. And again, it goes back to history, guys. History matters. History shapes our trust or our mistrust, right? When people mention Emmett Till, the Freedom Summer murders, James Byrd Jr., Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and a host of others, they're talking about more than individual cases. We're talking about more than individual cases. We're talking about a long history that influences how many people respond when another young Black person dies under unusual circumstances. History doesn't prove today's facts, I get that, but history explains today's emotions, and that's an important distinction. We also recently watched the Camilla Anthony case and how that generated intense public debate before all the evidence had been presented. I mean, social media often becomes the courtroom before the courthouse. So here's the challenge. How do we demand accountability without abandoning advocating for fairness? How do we insist on transparency without rushing to conclusions? Those questions are worth asking, right? Those questions are worth asking. So my questions for you today is, can we seek truth without assuming guilt? How much does history influence your trust in institutions today? You know, what have you experienced with some of these institutions that has impacted your ability to trust it? What does transparency look like? There is a legal process here. There's an investigation going on in this case, and but she has a great and amazing civil rights attorney. She, meaning his mom, his family, Nolan Wells' family, has a great civil rights attorney. Some people, by the term civil rights, they just feel, oh, that's a race baiter here. But I mean, he's an attorney. He's qualified. He's going to do what an attorney does. More importantly, he's going to do what Ben Crump does, right? And how he's able to come in and work with local attorneys. They're going to do their own independent investigation. And I think the family deserves that. But that's seeking the truth. That's not necessarily assuming guilt, because an investigation is the whole goal is to determine what is the truth, right? So I'm gonna ask the question again: should Black people care? Should Black people care? Should we care, y'all? Should we care about transparency in investigations while also insisting on fairness and due process? So when you step back, these stories aren't really about politics. They're all about power. They're all about trust. They're all about accountability. So again, my final segment, should Black people care? Today, we've talked about presidential power, Supreme Court decisions, election, administration, legislative accountability, showing up and doing your job, the death of Nolan Wells. On the surface, they seem like completely different stories. I don't think they are, because every one of them comes back to the same question: who has power? Who is accountable? Who do we trust? Should we pay attention before decisions are made, or only after they affect us? Whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, or politically exhausted, democracy asks something of all of us. Not that we agree, but that we stay informed, that we ask thoughtful questions, that we avoid rushing to judgment, y'all, that we hold our institutions accountable, and perhaps more importantly, that we remain engaged. We can take a break. I take a break from it because I get exhausted and traumatized. And I know that we are collectively traumatized because of history. But I'll leave you with the same question I asked at the beginning of today's segment: should Black people care? And I'm asking it because some of us seem to be detached. Some of us are just more inward focused, and maybe that's how we cope, right? Some of us, we may not have the mental fortitude to deal with everything that's going on in America today, and I get that. But maybe the better question should be, can we afford not to care? Can we afford not to care? Thank you for joining me for another edition of All Rights Reserved. I'm Yolanda Taylor, attorney Yolanda Taylor. Have a safe weekend. Stay informed, stay engaged, and remember, your rights don't protect themselves. They require informed citizens who care enough to pay attention. I'll see you next Saturday, but don't go anywhere. Stay right here to 92.1 FM.
All rights reserved with Yolanda Taylor on Choice.